Lord is a huge honor, a huge honor.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Professor Gus, what is your best definition of activism? And it can be an original idea, a definition, or it could be an adopted notion that you've come across. It could be a hybrid, it could be a bit of both.
Well, to be totally honest, it's not something that I think about. I just do, if you know what I mean. I've never really thought or even analyzed theoretically, let alone academically, what activism might mean. I know what it has constituted for me, and I know what it is not. Because as I said in my note to Alitha, what I find disturbing and disconcerting is the fact that there are too many people who confuse activism with narcissism.
Yes.
There are some high profile individuals, or at least they make themselves high profile, who call themselves activists, and they're described in media reports, etc., as activists. But effectively, they're self-promoting individuals who have a particular agenda, which might connect with our struggles and the sorts of issues that confront us. But effectively, it remains a very individual pursuit. For me, activism is about a belief in the possibility of collective action to bring about change. That's the only way I could summarize it. In other words, it is about something outside of yourself. It is about following and pursuing certain objectives which relate to your values. My activism began very early in Grenada, actually, when I was with my father and his generation, and indeed my mother, taking action against plantation owners, etc., who were starving out people, causing them to work very, very long hours for very little pay and all that kind of stuff. And that developed in me a huge sense, a passion indeed, for social justice. Because those arrangements were just wrong. They were fundamentally oppressive, right? So it was a matter of believing that we could take action to remove somebody's jackboot off our neck. And that is what we did as a community. Okay. Later on, when my father came here, I took another form of action, but I wouldn't call that activism in the sense that we mean, because it was an individual choice to do something about some oppression, which I felt I owed it to my father to do something about. The man was totally illiterate. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, he couldn't count. He worked extremely hard, huge long hours. And because he couldn't read, the people for whom he worked was constantly fiddling his wages. They wouldn't pay him what he was due. And then I discovered that his sense told him that something wasn't right. And so he asked me to check his wage packet, which I did. And then I discovered that for a number of weeks, if not months, they had been what's the word? They had been ignoring a whole number of days that he had done, ignoring all his overtime and everything else, and paying him a very, very basic wage. And I was totally incensed about that. Absolutely. Because the place where he was working was the American Air Base in West Ruislip in West London. And what really incensed me, I used to go down there. He was a caretaker. Okay. So he would have the task of cleaning up after all of these, and they were always having banquets. They would have all these huge banquets and a big dining hall, and this poor man alone would have to be going and clearing all the plates and dishes, getting rid of all the rubbish and everything else. It would take him the whole night to do that. And one particular night, I went down there with him and saw the amount of work that he was doing. And only the Friday before, I had to jack up somebody for stealing his wages. Mm-hmm. So I then decided to go around. They had a social club, officers' mess or whatever they called it. And in there, they had a whole line of one-armed bandits, yeah? The gaming things. And I don't know why I was so incensed when I saw what my father had to do. And what incensed me even more was on many of those plates, some of them would be twice the size of my laptop. They would be leaving half, sometimes almost a whole uneaten steak, right? Sirloin steak or ribeye or whatever it is. Yeah. Total waste of food and so on. And I thought, this is criminal. Yeah. So I spent the rest of the night. My dear father was doing his work in the canteen or wherever. I spent the rest of the night upturning every single one of those one-armed bandits. Coins flowed as if there was no tomorrow. I got some buckets and I filled them all with these dollar coins. My father says, "Where you get that? Where are you going with this?" I didn't tell him exactly where it came from. I made him believe that I had won it. So, but then the repercussion was, of course, that having upended those things, the coins went all into the workings of the whole thing, and they couldn't work. Yeah. So I wrecked the whole bloody stuff. But I collected thousands of dollars for my father, and I felt a sense of retribution. You know,
absolutely.
Right. So
it's that payment in lieu.
Indeed, that was driven by my sense of injustice and oppression.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I wouldn't call that activism, because in one sense it was individual action in relation to a particular set of circumstances, which related to how Black people and people of my father's generation, coming from a rural area, having been denied school, etc. That's how people exploit.
Exactly.
Right.
So there's a narrative there, but then there's also a symbolic meta narrative that it actually stands for. Precisely. So it was an individual choice on my part to avenge the wrong that was being done to my dad. Yeah.
So what I'm saying then is that we okay, so I believe that we as a people tend to forget one thing, that people could only keep doing things to you as long as you let them.
Very true.
And it goes in any situation, whether we're talking about domestic violence, whether we're talking about emotional abuse of parents by children, or whatever else it may be. Okay. So for that not to persist, you need to be prepared to take action.
Yes.
And it is, the activism comes in the taking of action with a declared purpose against a particular form of wrong or injustice or whatever else it may be.
Yeah.
And I believe that I mean, I believe fundamentally in social movements. Yeah. Whether it be women's movement, trade union movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, whatever it is, I believe fundamentally in people engaging in resistance activity in order, as my brother Les would say, to transcend their particular oppressive circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the contiguous relationship between resistance and transcendence is a model that he uses a lot, which I have a lot of time for.
Same. Yeah.
Right?
Same.
Okay. But you know, even in relation to those things, we're not always on the same page, because there are some people who would engage in action of a particular kind, which in my view is very negative. So you may know that I used to work with Sister Esther Stanford.
Yeah.
With the African Union on the sixth region project. Okay. And indeed, at one of the meetings in South Africa, I was asked whether I would coordinate a 6th region chapter in the UK, okay, starting in London, of course. And I agreed, and I tried. But one of the obstacles I found is that there were so many of us as African people, from the continent to a less extent than from the Caribbean, who took it upon ourselves to determine who was African and who wasn't. Some of them call themselves Pan-Africanists without understanding what the concept is, or being able to tell who the main fathers and mothers of Pan-Africanism actually were and what they stood for. And their perspective was so, well, not just sectarian, it was warped in my view. And I found that very troubling. One, because it was terribly divisive.
Yeah.
And two, because it was too fundamentalist. You know? I mean, okay, you know, I'm hopefully mature enough to understand that we as African people sit along a very broad spectrum, right? There are those of us who are very revolutionary, mm-hmm, in the right meaning of the term. There are some who are radical. There are many who are conservative. And God forbid, there's another bunch that are totally reactionary, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's all us. That's, mm-hmm, us as African people in all our diversity.
Yeah.
So there would be those who know that the British government are killing our elders and still want to stand up talking foolishness, like Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, I mean, so, but she's still African. She might not act as it, but she still is, and so on. So there's this very broad spectrum of people. If we then want to talk about moving on and uniting Africa, the continent, the motherland, with its dispersed diaspora, then we've got to remember that amongst that diaspora would be born-again Christians, would be neo-colonialists, would be capitalists, would be people who have no interest in the collective, yeah, except I, me, and myself.
That's right.
Right? So that is and you know, you were talking earlier about what colonialism has done to the motherland. That is played out in so many respects in terms of how we are and how we deal with ourselves and what we see as our destiny and how we treat one another in this society. So the task, therefore, has got to be, how do you begin to set an agenda which takes all of that into account and begins to identify some key elements of our journey so that one could begin to have debates about different types of things and different forms of engagement, including engagement when necessary with the British state. Because if it is responsible for so much damage everywhere, then we have to say, well, look, it is necessary for you to engage with us because we believe that you've got to make for this or that or the next thing, or think in terms of what reparations should mean, what decolonization should mean, these various contexts. So it requires some sound judgment, some maturity, some political nous to be able to do all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I think militates against us and our struggle for freedom and liberation is that rigidity and the insistence on excluding so many people because we either don't like what their religion is or what their particular orientation is towards this or that or the next thing. There would always be a need for some of us, at least, to be very, very clear about our direction of travel.
Yes.
But that puts us in a position of what I would call political leadership. And you know, you embrace that with humility, but also with affirmation and determination. And begin to demonstrate to people, A, that you can be trusted.
Yes. Because
you have integrity and you're consistent. I mean, I'd like to think that one thing people can say about me in relation to these matters is that, you know, from day one till now, I am totally consistent.
Yes.
If you come to Gus John, you know what you know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
So don't come to me with no foolishness. You know what I mean? And the same is true of Brother Les. That's why I love the man.
People the old block.
That's what I love. That's why I love my brother. Yeah. You know, don't come with any foolishness.
Yeah.
And so I think it is really about how we use individual issues and struggles both to build a critical mass of people who by struggling begin to gain an understanding of the issues facing us and a belief in our power to do something about it.
Yeah.
And you know, someone in my position and at my age, one of the reasons why I spend time and energy doing a lot of stuff with the young people, and I so welcome what your generation are doing, is that I believe it is very important to have people see that I reflect enough on all the long march I have been on since 1964 in this country, and can derive some nuggets of knowledge, wisdom, etc. from that, demonstrate the advances we have made, demonstrate the defeats we've had, and our reflection upon those so that we learn some lessons.
Absolutely.
If I'm able to share those lessons, it means that a new generation of people don't go and have to go repeating the same mistakes. So from that point of view, I believe that as an elder, I have that historical responsibility to guide, to teach, to encourage, to steer.
Yeah.
And so it is very important. I mean, you know, Fanon had this marvelous phrase that every generation has its own destiny to fulfill. We all have our own paths to tread. And there is an intergenerational and cross-generational coming together that must happen.
Yeah.
Because it's like building blocks, you know.
Absolutely.
And the most tedious people I find, and God knows there's too many of them, are those who believe that history began with them yesterday. And nothing that anybody else has done has any relevance whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's part of the arrogance of youth.
It is the arrogance. It's absolutely the arrogance. Yeah.
It's part of the arrogance of youth, which could be creative and cathartic in a sense, but it could also be taken too far, because you frustrate yourself, you waste time, you fail to learn from what those who went before you have done.
Absolutely.
And you also fail to understand that if we're all on a plateau, the chances of us seeing far into the distance is considerably more limited than if we stand upon one another's shoulders.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I just wish there was a bit more humility around the place, frankly.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. Very important point. And unfortunately, that again speaks to the ego, and often as well speaks to the fact that personality's center of gravity doesn't go beyond their sense of self-adulation, you know,
yes.
Which is unfortunate, because that is not in the spirit of the work of the Pan-African objective.
That's right.
So very, very important. To what extent do you feel that your life has been guided by this idea of activism?
I mean, well, really, it's been at the core of my existence, really. So, I mean, I landed in this place in 1964, August. And within months, I was assisting Caribbean parents with their children who had come over to join them, having been left behind for some time, and getting a terrible dumping down in schools and so forth. And because I was a student studying theology, City of Oxford, people looked to me for some knowledge of the system.
Yeah.
Although I myself had just got to this country. But obviously I knew how to research stuff. I knew how to talk to people who'd been here for longer and so on. And so I began to tap into various networks. John LaRose in London and New Beacon Books and Jessica and Eric Huntley in Ealing and so on. So, and I immersed myself into those networks, which were part of my own socialization into this crazy life in Britain. And it gave me the confidence to stand up to some people and you know, not take nonsense, because I knew that I wasn't walking alone. All of these people were there to be called upon. They were assisting me in understanding the society and how it functioned. They were assisting me in understanding how racism worked. so that I was able with that to be of more assistance to those parents, people, the women working in the Churchill and Radcliffe hospitals, the men working in the car factory in East Oxford and so on. And before I knew it, I was a kind of central figure within that community, organizing and reacting and resisting on a number of fronts.
Yeah.
In the workplace with the very racist trade union movements, in the hospitals where the nurses were having a pretty rotten time from some very backward managers and so on and so forth. So it is really how I was able to draw upon all of these other forces who were organizing in their own right. You know, in London, for example, against ESN schools and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That basically anchored me in that whole Gulf Stream, if you like, of political activity and resisting racism at structural and institutional and personal levels within the society. Yeah. And that's how it has been since, so that you may know that I was a director of education in the London Borough of Hackney for 8 years, just under 8 years. The first Black person to become a chief education officer in the UK.
Yeah.
It was a hellish job. It was at times, it seemed undoable. And at times it was unbearable. But the only reason why I managed not only to survive, but as my brother Les would say, to transcend, was because I came out of that particular stable. I had been in political activity with John LaRose and the North London West Indian Association, with people like Winston Best and Jocelyn Barrow and Molly Hunt, the educational psychologist, Waveney Bushell, and so on. So having been campaigning on education issues and the educational rights of Black children ever since I was doing theology in Oxford, by the time I came to be a chief education officer in Hackney, I was bringing to that job a completely different perspective, sets of expectations, and what have you, than all those white colleagues of mine who had come through being local government administrators in local authorities, no doubt frustrating parents left, right, and bloody center.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So it was bringing a different kind of consciousness and demanding more from the schools that I was managing.
Absolutely. It's almost as though, as much as you were in the same chambers, if you like, it was almost as though you were somehow coming from the opposite side of the aisle.
Precisely.
In terms of, you know, the experience that you brought to bear, the empathy, and also the knowledge, you know, of those within the community to speak directly and specifically to the issues of the community, which is something that inevitably they lacked. Whether you like it or not, there was a level of disaffection and, you know, absolute wanton neglect and deliberately so of actually keying in, honing in, zeroing in on what the issues within our community were. And to some extent, actually seeking to antagonize, which is pretty much what your battle has been, you know.
Well, indeed, absolutely.
And sounding the alarm, and not only sounding the alarm, but actually doing what needs to be done to redress the issues. So yeah, no, I think that's it's so wonderful to see that it's thinking about this definition of activism, that it is a response to a very real issue within the community, and seeking to actually address and improve the outcomes of that community.
Yeah.
So I think in its purest, if we're kind of going puritanical with it here, you know, it is ultimately just about looking at what are the issues within your community and how do you utilize what it is that you have within your arsenal, within your capabilities, you know, to at least attempt, I think is the key here, because I think if you set your expectation at resolving, it can actually dissuade you from even putting a hat in the ring in the first place. You know?
Exactly.
So I think the attempt is really where I think the emphasis needs to be, because you just don't know what the possibilities or the outcomes are, you know, but having that desire, you know, for better and recognizing that we as a community are worthy, I think is a good starting point, you know.
Indeed, and that our experiences collectively and historically place a responsibility upon us, which in many ways it doesn't for other communities.
That's right.
Within the society who are considered to be included and part of the mainstream.
That's right.
I remember saying to teachers, well, I say to all professionals, including this current crop of Black academics, some of whom irritate me badly. I don't want to sound intolerant. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I used to say to those teachers, I said, listen, somebody remonstrated with me at one point and said, you are director of education, we working in schools or the youth service or whatever, you seem to want to make activists out of all of us. Why can't I just come and go and do my teaching in school X and then go home and go about my business? And I said, my friend, let me tell you one thing. If you don't know it now, soon enough you're going to know it. There is no such thing about being a teacher, a social worker, or whatever who just happens to be Black. Get rid of that notion altogether. There's no such thing.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
If you're a Black teacher, it's packed with meaning.
Huge.
You know, it's packed with meaning. You can't do your craft with any kind of integrity if you don't understand what the schooling system is doing to Black kids, what therefore the expectations of their parents and they themselves as students have of you and expect you to deliver, how the white people around you see you and all the baggage they bring to their relationship with you.
Yeah.
You are going to give yourself a nervous breakdown unless you hook into all of that stuff and understand it.
That's it.
And understand how you are going to survive within it.
That's right.
So in other words, what I'm saying is that integrated in everything that I have done in my adult life has been that consciousness of political responsibility.
Yeah.
And that whole trajectory from my days as a student to all that I did within communities in relation to the uprisings in Moss Side in Manchester, where I was at the time, issues around anti-deportation struggles, around housing for Black people and Black youths in particular, all of those sorts of things. I became the chair of the Black Parents Movement in Manchester, having been a founding member of the movement in London, and began to take on the same kinds of issues. And as you say, help people with the knowledge I had, the information I could gather for them, to empower themselves.
Exactly.
To hold schools to account.
Exactly.
And that is that I see as essential, and it should be happening wherever we are.
I think so. I think for me, the important thing is sustaining this resistance and this attempt to reject, the status quo. In order to sustain that, you must be equipped. If it all rests on one person, if you are singularly the focal point, regardless of what your intention or your heart is, you will inevitably burn out.
It's not only a question of burning out. That is the road to demagoguery.
Yeah, that's true.
You encourage people to become demagogues.
Yeah, that's true.
And we had enough of those as well within our communities.
Yeah, that's very true.
And what that does is it silences people's voices. It is the complete antithesis of open, free, and democratic organization.
Yeah.
Because you invest so much power in that one individual, as if your own agency ceases to matter.
That's right. As you said, power, I was actually thinking of that very known phrase that, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, so, absolutely.
Yeah. Very much so.
So, and I mean, all of those tendencies we've had within our communities. I just took part in a film a couple of weeks ago, a documentary about a man. You may be too young to remember that period, but there was a fellow here in the late 60s, early 70s called Michael X. He took his name.
Yes. No, I do.
You do? Okay.
Yes,
all right.
I know.
So he used to be called Michael de Freitas.
Yes.
He was his father was Portuguese, his mother was Barbadian, but somehow he was brought up in Trinidad. And he was a demagogue. I mean,
he was.
A pretty nasty piece of work.
Yeah.
At the time, the whole sort of black politics at the time created people like himself, and they were given all kinds of accolades by the British media. The British media loves such people. And there were present day ones of them as well.
Agreed.
Including in academia.
Yeah.
It was absolutely shocking what that man did and how he destroyed people. So we've had our own fair share of those sorts of tendencies within our communities.
Yeah.
My brother Les and I have had this conversation regularly. I say to people, particularly the African separatists and the rest of them, I say to them, listen, if our revolution is not based on people's humanity and on love, then it is destined to fail. You can't be talking about revolution and about social and financial justice and the rest of it if you don't have a deep sense of humanity.
Humanity, completely.
Yeah. So for me, human liberation trumps all other kinds of liberation, whether it be women's liberation, black liberation, whatever that might mean, or anything else.
Yeah.
If you don't have a fundamental sense of human values and human worth and human liberation, you end up with what we have on the continent, So many people, even though they might identify with Pan-Africanism, concerned only about their bank balances. If you want to get rich, you don't become an industrialist, you become a politician. And you siphon off all the people's money to various big houses in Baker Street and Mayfair, and or into banks in Switzerland or whatever else it may be. And the more you have that kind of opulent lifestyle, is the more people gravitate around you.
Yeah.
And you could dash some naira here and dash some naira there, and so on. It's corrupt. It's obscene.
It is obscene.
You know?
It is.
So it's really a question of how one ensures that one's activism reflects certain human values.
Yeah.
That it is generally geared towards individuals' liberation, so that the quality of their lives is improved as a result of activism, and that they are more confident to shape their own destiny and stand up in their own defense.
Completely. Absolutely. You know, I think it's very easy in our current postmodern age for, as you said, the cult of personality to kind of win the day. So people, rather than being drawn to the, as you say, you know, the value in the humanity and the work that is centered and focused around the humanity of all, a lot of people unfortunately gravitate towards these personalities.
Yes.
Don't have that as their core ideology and their core,
absolutely,
you know. And so a lot of people are led astray, thinking in good faith that they're being led and directed towards the light. But
yes, and too often people become one-dimensional.
Yeah.
In a manner that is totally illogical and inconsistent. I mean, I can't be professing liberation and wanting to do something about racism and dealing with the system and so on and so forth, if I, the same person, have a reputation for domestic violence,
right,
or subjugating and making women subordinate, and whatever, and a lot of that used to go on, and it still goes on.
It does.
You know, so I mean, the number of instances where I have tried to intervene in situations where some hardworking, very conscious sisters were having to, I mean, they were holding it down, and in many cases they determined not to make it public.
Yeah.
But they were going through some real hell at the hands of these men in their homes.
Yeah, it still happens. Yeah. Still happens.
And you think to yourself, how on earth could anybody consider that to be acceptable? Don't come telling me no blooming nonsense about nothing.
Yeah.
If you then going home and making your life or your partner's a life hell, you can't convince me that there is anything meaningful about your black radicalism if that is the case.
It's the height of hypocrisy, and that's exactly what, you know, going back to what you were saying about recognizing the humanity ultimately of every being, every human being, you know, to be afforded the same level of equity and justice
and respect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Respect for yourself, you know.
Yes.
So a lot of that is missing. Unfortunately. I want to move on to the next question.
Sure.
So, to your understanding, how important is activism to the nation-building agenda within the Black community specifically?
I see it as essential. I see activism among us as absolutely essential, because we are we are confronted on so many issues. We are constrained from being the best that we can be. And we are made victims of the excesses of the state and its institutions. You know, whether it be schooling, policing, God knows whatever else. The one thing that obstructs our progress is when our people accommodate to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, just to as an aside, I'm writing something about that at the minute. Actually, I find it utterly unbelievable that in this year, when you've had ministers of state, Home Secretary, condemning the Black Lives Matter movement, condemning critical race theory, having Tony Sewell produce this racial disparities report and all of that stuff, when the hostile environment is still claiming the lives of elders. I find it utterly incredible that at this time, when so many Black health practitioners, consultants, doctors, nurses have lost their lives, having been put in the front line of the COVID recovery business, at this time, in this year, there have been more Black people accepting OBs and CBs and God knows what else than ever before. Now, how is that possible? How can, and then of course, there's always been stuff with Harry and Meghan and what may or may not have been said about Meghan's child and scholar. The recent reports about the Buckingham Palace not employing Black people as secretaries and all that kind of stuff. So we're good enough to clean the Queen's toilets, but not to be in an office doing office. How could you, knowing all of that stuff, then want to go and accept a CBE or OBE or MBE and go to the palace for
the very same palace that
yes, for Charles or William or whoever to pin some blooming thing on your lapel? I mean, what is that about?
Yeah.
I just frankly cannot understand it.
Yeah. I do you know what? Unfortunately, I can, because I recognize that there have always been and there will always be those who choose to look the other way in order to further their own personal interest, as you say, and who also, unfortunately, are the Sambos, you know, and that is an inevitability. You know, it hasn't changed. There will always be those who are out for their own interests and are happy to, willing to basically sell the community short. These are people who do have value to contribute, but unfortunately they choose to redirect that value into a system that can, as far as they're concerned, afford them a greater reward. You know, reward is quantified in monetary, in awards and accolades, as you say, and that for them is the sum total of achievement. That for them is what they look at as success.
But you know, the sad thing is that so many of those people don't need that validation. They don't need those people to validate them and their activities and their achievements and so on. I mean, I just find it utterly incredible. But more than that, you see, what I don't understand is why people should assume that they could dismiss the way in which the same state, the same Buckingham Palace, the same royalty, etc., treat people from within their communities young or old or whatever it may be. I mean, it seems to me that, during the pandemic, and when I heard about all of these doctors and nurses dying and so on, I thought to myself, if only we had the kind of political sophistication and political organization that could enable us to mobilize all Black health services staff from around the country to just stay at home for one day. Everybody who is not white, English, European, or whatever, just stay at home for one day, simply to make a point.
Yeah.
Without us, the whole goddamn thing would collapse.
Yeah.
Right? It would collapse. And so, and yet you are pushing us out up to the front to take the whole blast of that thing without proper PPE, without any risk assessment, without any risk mitigation. And then the rest of it just continue as normal. So why shouldn't the system continue doing what it is doing?
Absolutely.
If we demonstrate in the ways that we are doing, that we are perfectly happy for it to do that to us.
Got complicit,
Exactly.
And that's what it is, unfortunately. And it's a very difficult one to sort of square, in the sense that, it's almost chicken and egg, because, we recognize how the power structures mean that a lot of people are held hostage, unfortunately. And that cuts across racial lines as well, because if you look at it from a class perspective as well, that there are a lot of people who probably will find themselves in a very similar position, where they're resting back and not coming forward and not resisting and not actually engaging in the power of choice.
Yes.
Not engaging in the power of choice for fear of the machine.
Yes, exactly.
That's the reality.
Yes, because I mean, it's a kind of economic hostage as well,
That's what it is.
Would I lose my job? Would I have to give up my car? What about my mortgage? Blah, 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 blah. All of that kind of stuff.
So, that's why you see a lot of this performative stuff that's going on to act as a bit of a PR campaign to assuage any concerns and fears that we're not making progress. But as the late enduring Dr. Amos says, everything changes to remain the same.
Yes.
He tells us that we're not going anywhere, for things to kind of be as they are, and for our community, based on everything that you've just put forward, everything that you presented, and yet we're still not compelled enough as a group, to make a seismic move.
Yes.
And that tells you that, the platitudes, the OBEs, the virtue signaling is working. The propaganda campaign is working to assuage and to pacify the Black masses, unfortunately.
Let me just say this to you so that we end on a more hopeful note. What I have some faith in, as I intimated before, is that there are among us very many young people who are not as enamored of all of that kind of rubbish as an older generation. And in many cases, they see no reasons why they should even want to be bothered with it. What I think we need is to put a shield, work with and alongside them, but also put a shield of protection around them, so that they can be bold in their and assertive in their demands.
Yeah.
So that they can demonstrate that the society has no future if it doesn't take them into the reckoning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that they of whatever ethnicity, as well as white ethnics in this country, have got a massive task ahead to build a future that is not marred by all of that nonsense of racist oppression and aggressions, micro and macro and all that kind of business. and as I was saying earlier, use our own experience and knowledge to be able to help nurture that kind of leadership and activism amongst them, in order that they could have a better sense of, building something positive for the future. Because frankly, the way the soul system is structured, for too many young people, it is resulting in the abandonment of hope and the death of aspiration.
Wow.
And that's why so many of our young people are slaughtering one another on the streets.
Yeah.
We've got to break that cycle, immerse ourselves in their struggles, in support, rather in leadership of them, and do that intergenerational thing I was talking about earlier, so that we become stronger. They become stronger. They become more confident in what they have to do, because we're not simply leaving them exposed to the institutions of the state and the control apparatuses of the state, particularly the police and those people. And it is when we work towards that and see it becoming a reality in small matters as well as in larger matters, that we can begin to take some hope in our capacity as an African people in this country to be protagonists in our own destiny.
Absolutely.